Lecture 1, Misconceptions that Hinder Learning. Have you ever had a morning when you wake up in a bad mood and just have the feeling it's going to be a bad day, and then it is? Or have you ever faced a challenge where you thought to yourself that you were definitely going to struggle, and then you did? Maybe you consider yourself to be incredibly self-aware, or just a really good forecaster of the future. But I'm going to suggest an alternative explanation, that perhaps you unknowingly set yourself up to have that bad day, or to fail. On a similar note, raise your hand if you've ever said one of the following statements or something like it. I'm not a math person. Or, I'm just no good at dancing. Or, I'm too old for this. Or, I can't learn like that. Or, even more simply, I can't do that. There are many different reasons why you might struggle to learn or perform. Sometimes you really do lack the necessary skills, knowledge, or physical stamina. Sometimes you lack the support or resources that you need to be successful. But sometimes the problem lies in your own head. Sometimes we're our own worst enemies without realizing it. Regardless of your actual ability or even your potential, the stories you tell yourself and what you believe about yourself have powerful influences on your behavior and are therefore powerful predictors of your actual success. Right or wrong, your beliefs can motivate you to learn and grow, or they can just as easily hold you back and prevent you from ever trying, or cause you to shut down at the first sign of difficulty. As Henry Ford once said, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. Fortunately, thanks to the field of psychology, we also know that it's possible to change our beliefs and to break negative belief behavioral cycles that sometimes hold us back. Sometimes it requires major shifts in thinking, but sometimes even minor shifts can have profound effects on our lives. Our beliefs, both conscious and subconscious, can shape our behaviors, and no one's immune to flaws in their thinking. As you'll see, even the most successful among us may still be guilty of holding certain, often unchallenged beliefs that do more harm than good. In this lecture, I'm going to identify some fundamental misconceptions about learning that are relatively common, but that too often keep people from reaching their full potential. Specifically, I will challenge 4 implicit and explicit assumptions. 1, that ability is fixed, mostly innate, or otherwise predetermined. 2, that learning should always be relatively quick and easy. 3, that failure is bad or something to be avoided at all costs. And 4, that people have specific styles in which they learn everything best. By the end of this lecture, hopefully you'll understand that learning at any age is possible, that challenges are necessary and valuable, that all skills can be developed with deliberate practice and effort, and that using a variety of learning strategies is most beneficial. The sooner you understand and endorse these principles, the better equipped you'll be to achieve your learning goals. Let's start by revisiting some of the statements from the start of this lecture. I'm not a math person. I'm just no good at dancing. I'm too old for this. Now, on the surface, these statements might seem like realistic evaluations. After all, it is true that people differ in their abilities. Someone might say, I'm not a math person, but immediately follow up by saying, I am an artist. Personally, I'm not afraid to admit that I am not a good dancer. You would probably cringe if you heard me singing. I know very little about auto mechanics and even less about tax code. On the other hand, I'm a fairly successful educator. I can speak for hours on topics of a psychological nature. I'm not bad when it comes to drawing, and I'm an above-average cook. No one is good at everything, and all of us are better at some things than others. It's also true that, as we age, some of our memory capabilities decline. Research does suggest that older adults, especially those over age 65, tend to learn less and have more trouble adapting to new situations compared to people in their 20s. However, there's a big difference between being able to recognize our strengths and weaknesses and believing that they're somehow immutable or completely out of our control. Just as acknowledging how our learning abilities change over time is not the same as suggesting that learning actually stops, that it becomes impossible, or even that it becomes unlikely. In other words, just because you lack skill or ability at the present moment, or just because you aren't learning as quickly or as easily as you used to, doesn't mean that you can't learn. Carol Dweck from Stanford University argues that we need to examine the underlying assumptions and how we talk about ourselves and our abilities. Two people might say the same thing, I'm not very athletic, but they might mean something very different. Through her research, Dweck identified two kinds of people. People with growth mindsets are those who believe that their ability can be improved through hard work and effort, whereas people with fixed mindsets tend to believe that ability is mostly innate and therefore difficult, if not impossible, to change. Either you have it or you don't. So when someone with a growth mindset says, "I'm not athletic," what they mean is that they aren't currently athletic, but they aren't discounting the possibility that they could become more athletic in the future. But when someone with a fixed mindset says, "I'm not very athletic," what they're really saying is, "I'm not athletic and I never will be." And that difference in meaning can have profound effects on our behaviors, which ultimately predict the likelihood that we are successful on any given task. In multiple classroom and laboratory studies, Professor Dweck and other researchers have compared how people with fixed and growth mindsets respond to challenging tasks. What they found that people with growth mindsets persist longer, try a wider range of strategies, and ultimately solve more problems than people with fixed mindsets. In research contexts, people with fixed mindsets put considerably less time and effort into assigned tasks and are more likely to give up, even when they have the same overall ability levels as the other learners. In other words, the difference in outcomes is not due to differences in their actual ability or intelligence. Rather, it's the result of the different stories they're telling themselves. Their beliefs become reality. Those who believe that they simply lack ability and can't improve don't really try, which is what leads to failure. Those who believe they can improve try harder, which is what leads to growth and success. And the same results have been found in other domains outside of academia. For example, when it comes to athletics, relationships, and even in business. What Professor Dweck's research tells us is that your mindset greatly affects the way that you actually lead your life and can ultimately determine whether you accomplish your goals and become the person you want to be, or whether you stagnate and fall short of your potential. Just like having a bad attitude can set the stage for a bad day, having a fixed mindset can negatively affect your likelihood of being successful. It's kind of like putting a jinx on yourself. We all have self-doubts, and it's healthy to be a little self-critical and cautious, as it is to recognize our own limits. But if we doubt ourselves to the point of concluding that failure is inevitable from the start, we're really only guaranteeing that it happens. It's simply not true that abilities are fixed or unchangeable. People might be born with some level of natural talent, but they aren't born fully developed. Our genes might dictate where we start, but they don't define us, and they certainly don't guarantee how our lives go or what we achieve. Success comes from a combination of ability and effort. If you want to learn, if you want to better yourself, then you've got to be willing to put forth the effort, and before you make the effort, you've got to believe that that change is possible. Now, that's not to say that we have complete control over our success, or that we are entirely to blame for our failures. It's not all about effort. We also need access to resources, support, and opportunities. I can be a skilled fisherman, but it won't matter if I can't afford a fishing rod or if I'm prevented access to the water. But the point is that we have a lot more control than we often realize, and the potential to learn and improve is always there. Considering all of the real external obstacles we may encounter, the least we can do is to ensure that we aren't getting in our own way or holding ourselves back. And by the way, you know the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Well, I'm here to tell you that that is a myth as well. Learning is possible at any age, in any subject, for any person. You might not become a superstar or the next Einstein, but psychological research consistently shows that you have the potential to learn and change throughout your lifetime. So the next time you find yourself doubting your abilities or capacity for change, you should try to train your mind to think differently. Every time you catch yourself wondering, can I do this? Instead, change that question to an affirmation and say, I will do it the best I can. And every time you hear yourself thinking, I can't do this, change it to, I can't do this yet. And then work on figuring out what you can do to make progress. Another closely related assumption that often underlies mindsets is the belief that learning should be quick or easy. Some people believe that learning should be, or is supposed to be, relatively effortless. And so when they encounter challenges, or when they struggle with something, they interpret that as meaning that they're somehow out of their league, or that they don't belong, or that they're otherwise incapable. In other words, challenge signifies a lack of ability. But as with fixed mindsets, the belief that learning should be simple and without any hurdles along the way also causes us to shy away from certain activities or to avoid challenges altogether. But in doing so, we end up missing out on opportunities to learn and grow. In a similar way, sometimes we assume that a good parent is one who removes all potential barriers to their kids' success. You might have heard the phrase helicopter parent, or in Wisconsin we sometimes say curling parent, after the sport where players run ahead to smooth the path of a stone gliding on ice and guide it to a desired goal. Well, it's true that good parents provide guidance and support to help their children be successful, but too much support is ultimately a disservice to their development because it prevents them from building new skills, autonomy, resilience, and the self-confidence that comes from working through challenges. Making success easy might increase positive emotions and short-term performance, but it may actually hurt kids in the long run. The best learning opportunities are those that are challenging, not impossible, but tasks that do require a good amount of time, thought, or effort. If we really want to grow, then we have to push ourselves out of our own comfort zones. We should feel a little uncertain or anxious if our goal is to truly expand in some way. Likewise, if we really want our kids or students or employees to grow, then we have to give them more responsibility and let them stumble and struggle a bit. Robert and Elizabeth Bjork at UCLA call this desirable difficulties. And research shows that persisting through such difficulties leads to deeper, more durable learning. Experiencing success after challenge is also much more personally gratifying and rewarding. It's something you can be proud of. So embracing desirable difficulties is basically the opposite of trying to stay comfortable, or taking the safe and easy route, or trying to prevent mistakes. It means making things more challenging, pushing yourself, and being willing to take risks and make mistakes that you can actually grow from. If you're never feeling frustrated or challenged or uncomfortable, then you're probably not growing very much, if at all. I often liken it to weight training. You've probably heard the saying, no pain, no gain, right? In order to build muscle, you've got to tear muscle. When you lift weights, what you're really doing is creating micro tears in your muscle fibers. And muscle growth is the result of your body continually repairing those tears. A successful weightlifter doesn't just lift the same weights over and over. She incrementally increases the weight and repetitions over time to build more muscle. Of course, it is possible to overdo it. Muscle strains and sprains can cause major setbacks. And that's actually a good reminder of the benefits of taking it slow sometimes and being patient with yourself. Slow growth is still growth, and sometimes it's more sustainable and long-lasting. We need a certain amount of time to process and recover, whether we're talking about physical growth or mental growth. As another analogy, if you're training to run a race, you really need to push yourself during practice. Repeatedly walking the distance, especially if you can already do it without much effort, isn't going to make the main event any easier, and it's not going to help improve your time. You've got to make yourself sweat. That's why we call them workouts, right? You've got to make yourself work. This principle has important implications for how we study, too. If we really want to master something, then we have to be willing to test ourselves in different ways, ask deeper questions, and fully engage with the content prior to when we really need it. Now, my students often think that exams are the hard parts of learning. But what I tell them is that everything that comes before the exam should be the hard part. The more effort you put into studying, and the more you actively challenge yourself during that process, the more prepared you will be for the real test down the line. Inevitably, though, some of my students ask, and you might also be wondering, yeah, that sounds good in theory, but what happens when you can't overcome the challenges you face? What happens when those challenges aren't so desirable, but instead are overwhelming? What happens when you do fail? To answer that question, let me pose another question to you. What do Abraham Lincoln, Michael Jordan, Charles Schultz, and Albert Einstein have in common? I'll give you a few moments to think. You might have come up with some of your own ideas. They happen to all be men, for example. But the commonality I want to highlight here is that they were all failures. Not in the greater sense, of course, but if you look at their biographies, you'll notice that they all shared the common experience of encountering numerous failures and setbacks in their careers. For example, before becoming one of the best basketball players in history, Michael Jordan was cut from the varsity basketball team as a high school sophomore. Albert Einstein failed his first entrance exam to the Zurich Polytechnic School. Charles Schulz, the creator of the beloved Peanuts comic strip, had his cartoons rejected by his high school yearbook staff and eventually by Walt Disney. And before becoming president, Abraham Lincoln lost several lower-level elections. How many of you could honestly say that you would have persisted or even dreamed of becoming president after losing several prior elections? But thankfully, Lincoln didn't give up, and neither did any of the others. History is replete with examples of successful people just like them, who had anything but clear or straightforward paths to success. Even Thomas Edison is said to have failed 1,000 times before successfully inventing the light bulb. And that's the point. The majority of the most successful people in history are not those who avoided challenges or who never experienced adversity and failure. The most successful people just weren't deterred by them. They learned from their mistakes. They persisted through those hardships, and they overcame those setbacks. No one likes to fail, and that makes perfect sense. Failure doesn't feel good, and it usually comes with costs, often in the form of lost opportunities. For example, not getting that job, but also lost time, effort, and even dignity. However, for the overwhelming majority of us, failing is inevitable. It will happen at some point. So the best we can do is to be prepared for the possibility and willing to learn from it. As I noted before, no one has 100% control over their success, but you do have control over how you interpret failure. Either you can let yourself be dejected and do nothing, or you can resolve to try something different in the future. Connecting it back to mindsets, failure can sometimes result from a lack of ability, but it's not an inherent sign of lack of ability, nor does it mean that you will always lack ability. We can't know our true capabilities unless we are willing to push ourselves out of our comfort zones and take risks. And taking risks means that sometimes we will fail. Just like an infant learning to walk, the more we view failure as an essential part of the learning process and as an opportunity for important feedback, and therefore not as something to be avoided at all costs, the more likely we can continue to improve and actually reach our potential. Last but not least, another way that we hold ourselves back is by insisting that we can only learn in certain ways. Many of you have probably heard of the idea of learning styles. But in case you haven't, learning styles is a theory about how our minds work. The basic idea is that we all have one main way of thinking, or one dominant style of thinking that helps us learn best. Over 70 different styles have been proposed, but some of the most common are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. So someone with a visual learning style supposedly learns best through images, someone with an auditory style supposedly learns best by listening, and someone with a kinesthetic style supposedly learns best through hands-on manipulation or physical movement. And so the key implication is that in order to maximize learning, we need to first identify our learning style and then choose environments or otherwise adapt instruction to match that style. Now, on the surface, this theory is intuitively appealing. It sounds good, and it resonates with a lot of people. But I want to make it immediately clear that, regardless of how popular the belief might be, there is actually no evidence that learning styles exist in the way I just described. I know that might be shocking to some of you, but before you get too defensive, hear me out. It's true that many people have preferences for how they learn. So some people would prefer to listen to a lecture as opposed to reading one. And some people might prefer to learn cooking through their own trial and error as opposed to reading or following a recipe. As we've already discussed, it's also true that people differ in their ability levels, including things like visual spatial skills. Some people are just really good at navigating new spaces. Some people are great at recognizing faces, and some people have really vivid visual memories. But when it comes down to it, there's no evidence that we learn everything best the same way, or that those differences in visual spatial skills, for example, are equally advantageous in all settings. It really depends on what we are learning. And outside of certain learning disabilities or sensory impairments, all of us are capable of learning in multiple ways, and we all use different ways of learning. To demonstrate those points, let's try a brief thought experiment inspired by the work of cognitive psychologist Daniel Willingham. If I were to tell you that I wanted to teach you something, and then asked you how you wanted me to teach it, could you answer that question without knowing what I was going to teach you? Would your answer differ if I said I wanted to teach you how to get to Oconomowoc, Wisconsin from where you are, versus how to pronounce Oconomowoc, versus how to spell Oconomowoc? What if I wanted to teach you how to differentiate the melodies of different songbirds, or their markings, or how to ride a bike, or what lilacs smell like? If you're like most people, your desired instructional method would depend on what you were learning. Surely it would be easier to identify flower smells by having the opportunity to actually smell them, as opposed to just looking at pictures. Surely it would be easier to differentiate two songbird melodies by actually hearing them, as opposed to feeling the birds with your hands. Just as getting on the bike is probably going to be the most important aspect of learning how to ride one. And that's exactly what research shows. First, that people use multiple learning styles and don't usually have a singular preference. And second, that the content itself often dictates what learning strategies or styles will work best for everyone. But if that thought experiment didn't convince you, I hope you will at least trust me when I say that decades of controlled studies on this topic, across multiple subjects and with all different types of people, point to the same conclusion, which is that there's just no evidence that teaching to one's preferred style actually enhances learning, independent of the content itself. Now, that doesn't mean that all learners are the same. Again, people differ in their ability level, their interests, their background knowledge, all of which can and do influence learning. The idea of learning styles is just one less thing we need to worry about. But why should we care? Why is that important? Because once again, believing that you learn best one way or that you can only learn one way is yet another way that we unnecessarily limit ourselves and engage in self-sabotage. If you believe that you're a visual learner or that you can't learn through auditory methods, then you're more likely to shut down when auditory methods are used. And you're more likely to make excuses for why you aren't learning instead of reevaluating your own efforts or instead of trying something different. The belief in learning styles is not only inaccurate, but it's really just another version of having a fixed mindset and another way that we potentially hold ourselves back. And that brings me to the key takeaway of this lecture. If you want to succeed, you first have to believe that you can succeed. And you have to be willing to adjust your approach when it's not working. You've probably heard someone say something like, well, that's just the way I am. I can't help it. Well, guess what? Yes, you can. Throughout this lecture series, I'll introduce strategies and approaches to learning that have been shown to be effective, and I'll give examples of how you can incorporate them into your life. It doesn't mean learning will always be easy or that success will happen right away, but having a growth mindset and employing research-based learning strategies will decrease the likelihood that you get trapped by self-imposed limits and will ultimately increase the likelihood that you achieve your learning goals.